Hello and thanks for downloading our video on effectively negotiating. Our goal here is to give you some tips and introduce you to the art of negotiation and how to effectively negotiate with buyers or buyer's agents. We're going to consult with you on what your options are, what are typically negotiable items in a real estate transaction, and how to communicate those back and forth between yourself and the buyer. Obviously, we want to make sure that you get every single penny that buyer's willing to pay for the property you have on the market. When you finally get an offer or you find a buyer who's interested in your property, negotiations can start right away. Unfortunately, a lot of folks are not comfortable with negotiations, especially when dealing with their own personal property. So we have a few underlying principles that we'd like to outline for you when you're dealing with negotiations. Number one, don't be afraid of negotiations. It's required in all big transactions. Second, understand that negotiations are generally a buying signal. Third, you want to ask yourself, when did the negotiations start? If it was at the beginning of the transaction before you got an offer, it probably wasn't that big of a deal. However, if it's in the offer, then we're going to want to address it. Four, were they asking a question or were these buyers just stating an opinion? For instance, wow, that's a lot to pay for the house. You just say, well, the house is worth it. They're just asking an opinion. They're not necessarily asking you to lower the price. Five, will it keep you from agreeing on a deal? Is this negotiable item a deal breaker for the potential buyer? Make sure you understand that. And I always tell my clients to ask themselves, in a year, will it matter what you did? And then last but not least, always understand you can't be reasonable with unreasonable people. There's three different areas of negotiations with any offer. Negotiations on price, negotiations on terms, and negotiations on contingencies. When negotiating on price, you've got three different options. Accept the price that they've offered to you, reject the price that they've offered to you, or counter, tell them what price would be acceptable. Remember, whether or not you counter or reject, you are essentially rejecting the offer. The only thing a counter does is tell the buyer what would be acceptable to you. A rejection puts the ball back in the buyer's court and basically tells them to come up with a different number. The second area of concern, of course, is negotiation on terms. You're going to want to focus on the various terms of the contract, which can include, is there any personal property included with the sale? What's the timeline? Are they going to close quickly or in 90 or 120 days? Is there a commission or a bonus to be paid to a potential buyer's agent? Are there any conditional issues that need to be met prior to closing? Keep in mind that you're going to want to negotiate all of these terms, and any change in these terms is effectively rejecting the initial offer. Also, bear in mind that you may have to negotiate again once the inspections are done when you're talking about repairs. One of the last things you're going to want to take note of in the contract are the contingencies of the contract. There's a financing contingency generally, an inspection contingency, and then maybe they have to sell a property or their house is currently under contract, so they have a closing contingency. What are the details of each of these contingencies if they're on the contract? For instance, if they have a financing contingency, have they already been pre-approved for a loan? Or will they apply for a loan within a certain period of days? How long do they have to get in order to get pre-approved by a mortgage lender in the area? There's also an inspection or repairs contingency. How long do they have to inspect the property? If they find items that aren't working in the property, do you have to repair those items at the buyer's request? Or is the property being sold as is? And last but not least, the sale contingency. Do they have a house they need to sell before they can close on your property? Is their property currently under contract and they need to close on that house before they can close on your property? Make sure you understand the details of the financing, the inspections, and the sale contingencies before moving forward with any contract. When you first get your offer, there's a few underlying principles that you can utilize in order to effectively determine how the buyer came about with the offer that they're giving you. We like to call them questioning techniques. You want to use open-ended questions in order to determine how the buyer came up with their offer. Remember, when questioning, be polite, be professional, be positive. That way you have the best way of putting the buyer at ease and making sure you have the best chance for working out the deal. Here are some questions that you might ask the buyer once you receive the offer. What is it that you like best about our home? Why did you choose this property to make an offer on? Is it necessary for the buyer to sell their house before you can qualify for a loan? Or why did the buyer choose this time for closing? This looks like a great offer. Is there a particular reason you asked for this much in closing costs? Thanks for your offer. How did your buyers come up with their price? Or how did you come up with the price if you're dealing directly with the buyer and not a buyer's agent? These are just some techniques that you can use based on the provisions of the contract. So you want to go through the contract step by step and outline everything that the buyer is asking for so that you can respond to it succinctly. When we talk about rejecting or countering an offer, we always want to do it in writing and make sure that you address your rejection or counteroffer directly to the buyers, regardless of whether or not an agent is involved. Remember, when rejecting the offer in writing, you want to make sure that letter includes these 4 things. Number 1, a thank you. Thank them for their interest and their time. Number 2, you want to tell them specifically why you are rejecting their offer. Was it the price, the terms, a contingency? Next, you also want to maybe utilize the zone of potential agreement. You feel that their offer is way out of the zone of potential agreement, so you don't want to waste any of their time or your time going forward. Last but not least, leave the door open for them to come back. Be sure you tell them, we would certainly consider a different offer from your buyer if they decide they'd like to make a change in the future. Be professional and be polite, especially when rejecting an offer outright. Our recommendation is that you always counter any offer, whether it's a small counter or not. In your counter letter, you want to make sure you address these 4 things. Number 1, again, thank them for their time and their interest. Number 2, outline specifically what about their offer is unacceptable and how it would need to change in order to be acceptable to you. Then you want to go ahead and justify the reasons for your change using logic and statistics, not feelings and emotions. Last but not least, leave it on a positive note. Say, hoping for a positive response and a successful transaction. Once you understand a few different things about negotiations, it puts you miles ahead of the competition. Most people, unfortunately, are not effective in negotiating large sale items. So if you know how to negotiate a real estate transaction, it puts you ahead of the game and any potential buyers. Remember to ask questions, focus on what you need to change, and keep the feelings and emotions out of it. Stay arm's length away. Be professional, be polite, and you'll do just fine, making sure that you get the highest offer a buyer is willing to pay. Thanks again for downloading this video on negotiations, and we wish you the best of luck selling.